Now it is my privilege to introduce you to our luncheon chair and moderator, Michael Goldberg. He is a partner with the law firm of Baker Botts. He is currently the firm-wide practice group chair for international arbitration and dispute resolution. His accolades are far too many for me to enumerate here, but he is a prodigious giver of his time and efforts to many charitable causes, including TDS, and we are very grateful for his help today. So, ladies and gentlemen, Michael Goldberg.
Thank you, Murray, for those kind words. I am pleased to chair this Light of Justice event honoring the 25th anniversary of the Texas Defender Service. For today's program, we have a diverse and impressive group of panelists to discuss the state of the criminal justice system in the United States. Since this is a Zoom event, we didn't want to take any chance of bad connections or anything like that. So the panelists and I met last week and taped the discussion we had. The good news is, as soon as the tape is over, all the panelists have come back, will come back and join us live, and we'll be able to answer any questions that any of you in the audience may have. So during the discussion, if you think of some questions, please write them down. You'll see a button at the bottom of your screen for Q&A. Write your questions during the discussion, and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can at the end of the first presentation. So with that, with no further ado, let's roll the tape. I want to thank you all in the audience for joining us for the 25th anniversary of the Texas Defender Service. With the panelists we have today, I believe you will find this to be an interesting and highly informative discussion. Our three distinguished panelists, Christina Swarns, Wesley Lowery, and Evan Mintz, have all been incredible leaders in the movement to transform how people understand and then seek change in our criminal justice system. First, Wesley Lowery. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and author who's currently a correspondent for 60 and 60, a 60-minute spinoff. Wesley was previously a national correspondent at the Washington Post. He led the team awarded the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting in 2016 for the creation and analysis of a real-time database to track fatal shootings in the United States. His most recent project, Murder with Impunity, is an unprecedented look at unsolved homicides in major American cities. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2019. Evan Mintz was a 2017 finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in editorial writing for a series on gun laws, gun culture, and gun tragedy. He previously served as deputy opinion editor for the Houston Chronicle, where he wrote editorials, solicited and edited op-eds, curated the online opinion, and spearheaded the political endorsement process. He also served as interim editor of the editorial board and was a finalist for the 2018 Burl Osborne Award for Editorial Leadership. Evan now develops communications for the criminal justice system at Arnold Ventures, a Houston-based philanthropy. Evan received his law degree from the Cardozo School of Law, where he served as editorial board editor of the Cardozo Jurist. He also worked as executive editor at the Rice Thresher, the student newspaper at Rice University, where he received a bachelor's degree in history and the Bob Award for writing and journalism. And last but certainly not least, Christina Swarns. She is the executive director of the Innocence Project, which we all know helps exonerate the wrongly convicted through DNA testing and working on reforming the criminal legal system to prevent future injustice. Christina previously served as the president and attorney in charge at the Office of the Appellate Defender, OAD, one of New York City's oldest providers of indigent appellate representation. Prior to joining OAD, Christina served as the litigation director for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Christina also argued and won Buck v. Davis in the United States Supreme Court. In this 2017 decision, the court vacated Dwayne Buck's death sentence and denounced the, quote, noxious strain of racial prejudice, unquote, that infected the case after an expert witness testified that Mr. Buck was more likely to commit criminal acts of violence in the future because he was Black. Christina earned her JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School and a BA from Howard University. So now with these introductions, let's begin our discussion. We will try to save time at the end of the discussion for questions. If any of you have questions, please, as soon as you think of them, put them in the chat line and we'll try to get to them at the end of the presentation. Now let's get started. With a constantly changing news cycle and an upcoming election, many people are laser focused on criminal justice and police reform. Thus, it seems like we're at a moment where real change may happen, despite what we're seeing with the resuming of executions at the federal level. The first topic for the three of you is, do you see the current movement or moment really leading to change? Wesley, we'll start with you. Do you feel like you've seen this before, or does this feel different?
Well, thanks for having me, and thank you for kicking that question over here. I think a few things can be true all at once. The first is that, and everyone on this call knows, a big part of the complication in terms of changing the way our criminal justice system works in the United States of America is the fact that we have a largely local and state level system. We've seen significant shifts in prosecution ideology and who's being elected as prosecutors. We've seen pretty remarkable changes in the law enforcement posture towards transparency, and we've also seen significant shifts in public opinion as it relates to any number of these issues. And those, we're currently at a point where one of the most recent polls showed a majority of Americans have broad opposition to police unions or are in favor of all non-violent police calls not involving actual police officers. Those are things that, in terms of public opinion polling or popular opinion polling, was largely impossible even 5 years ago in terms of where a majority of the country would be. I do think that when you talk to people who are in this space, some of the fixes that need to happen in the criminal justice system are things that have been so clear for so long. There's become a frustration that some of these things haven't been addressed more quickly. But that said, I think it's kind of unquestionable that there is significant change, that we're in a moment where once we get out the end of it, our system will look very different than where it was at the beginning of it.
Tina, you've watched people demand change before. What about you? Do you think we're in a unique moment for change?
Over the arc of my career, I've seen a dramatic shift in the way we as a community and we as a country relate to issues of criminal justice. When I started out as a public defender, even folks in the liberal progressive left, weren't in full support of criminal justice reform. Many of the mainstream civil rights and progressive organizations did not have criminal justice initiatives. And of course, criminal justice was the third rail of American politics. The only time it came up was when politicians sought to establish themselves as tough on crime. Now we're in a world where every candidate for president has a position about how criminal justice can be improved, and things have really changed dramatically. In terms of whether this is a movement or a moment, I think it depends ultimately on whether we actually get to the point of making true changes to the structures of the criminal justice system. Time and again, we've been in a position where we've seen small incremental changes to sort of emergency situations. But ultimately, for this to become a moment, we need to see real structural changes in the way we operate as a system. We need to see things like changes to the way race continues to play a role in the criminal justice system, changes to the way prosecutors and the police are held accountable in the criminal justice system, and changes in the way defense counsel is provided in the criminal justice system. Until we have real, meaningful structural change, until we are committed as a society to making that structural change, I'm not quite ready to say it's more than a moment.
As a communications expert dealing with criminal justice, what do you see are the strengths and weaknesses of how this movement is demanding change?
Thanks for that question. And first, I have to say, sometimes it's hard to assess strengths or weaknesses of a historic moment when you're in the middle of it. Maybe 20 years from now, we'll look back and something that seemed innocuous at the time turned out to be a huge turning point in American history. But looking at it while we're in the middle of it, there are some reasons to be optimistic. There are reasons to be pessimistic. Never before have we seen a push for civil rights like this that is simply so diverse. And to be blunt, that means white people are on board too. It's not just a specific segment of society, is a broad swath of the United States recognizing a fundamental truth that systemic racism is real. The criminal justice system is failing at its task of protecting and serving all Americans. That is a real strength. On the other hand, there are a lot of ways this can go wrong. The energy is going to start to fade. Barriers to real reform like police unions or politics as usual are just going to withstand the moment. Biden will get elected and the fever will break, or people will be content with symbolic changes that don't really make the systemic change that we all need to actually fix the underlying problems. The movement could become unfocused, and all these things are potential weaknesses. Now, on election day, I think there's going to be a litmus test that'll tell us whether or not this movement has real strength. And it's not going to be the presidential election. It's going to be in California, where voters are casting their ballots for Prop 25. It's a referendum on implementing pretrial reforms that will eliminate cash bail for the entire state. Cash bail is discriminatory. It keeps people behind bars, not because they're a threat to public safety, but because they are poor. And any systemic reform needs to target cash bail. So by those measures, you'd think in a progressive state like California, this would be a slam dunk, but it's not. Mainstream Democrats are on one side and Republicans are on the other. And any time you see a fight devolve into partisanship, that's bad news. Serious, lasting reforms have to cut across the political spectrum. But there's another side to it too. Progressives and civil liberty groups don't like the bill either. They don't like how Prop 25 expands judges' discretion to detain people before trial. They don't like how it relies on pretrial assessments. And they don't like how it empowers probation departments. Now, this isn't the bill they wanted. It's a flawed bill. Release should be out of the default setting. But this is going to be a first step. And this is also going to undermine a key opponent to structural reforms, which is the bail bond industry. You know, it looks a lot like when Texas Republicans started to pass tort reforms. You know, maybe they wanted that, maybe they didn't, but what it really did was undercut key supporters for the Democratic Party. If you want these reforms to go through, if you want this to be a powerful movement, you not only have to push yourself, you have to undermine the barriers. And if Prop 25 passes, that's going to happen. If it fails, I think that the firing line is turned into a circle.
It's interesting, Evan. Thank you. Now, for all of you, Christina, you started talking about the political aspects in your last answer. But for all of you, what lessons can we learn about how elected officials respond to grassroots pressure that we're seeing? Christina, start with you.
I think what we've seen over the last, certainly the last 6 months, but really over the last 5 years, is how pressure from the community can change and does change dramatically how politicians respond to these issues of criminal justice. Folks have turned out and really spoken out about what they have seen on cell phone videos across the country about how police interact with American citizens, predominantly Black citizens, and they've raised their voices in protest. And because of that, politicians at both the state, local, and national level have had to adjust and respond. It's been a sea change in the way that we as a community focus on issues of criminal justice and recognizing how ultimately local, right, the power is around issues of criminal justice, right? Historically, we have all sort of focused on national politics and haven't really prioritized local elections. But the truth of the matter is that elected prosecutors are in our county levels, right? Elected sheriffs, elected law enforcement officials are the ones that are making day-to-day difference, making the day-to-day difference around how criminal justice in this country is administered. And so what we have recognized, and I think what we have seen over the last couple of years, and certainly over the last 6 months, is that when we in local communities speak up and we make clear that we are not going to accept sort of business as usual with the way policing and prosecution has been done in this country, things can change. We now have serious campaigns for prosecutors across this country where you have money flowing in from throughout the country in elected prosecutor races, and it's really changed the way criminal justice is conceptualized and implemented across the country. So I think that this is a real moment where the people, right, the community has recognized the power they have to influence the way criminal justice is administered in this country, and it has changed it for the better.
Evan, same question. How elected officials respond to grassroots pressure?
Well, let me try to keep the focus right here in Houston, because after 7 years on the editorial board, I think that's where I have the most insight. And I want to point to a few examples of elected officials responding to grassroots pressure, or perhaps more accurately, not responding to it. Anyone who watches Houston City Hall closely knows exactly how criminal justice reform is going to go at City Hall. The mayor will appoint a committee. They'll write a report. The report will have some policy recommendations, some big, some small, and then the report will go on a shelf. We've seen this happen before, and it's happening right now. And frankly, I don't blame the mayor, I don't blame city council for acting this way. They have to worry about a powerful police union, which turns out voters and makes donations. They have to worry about old people who really freak out about crime, to be blunt. The average voter in a Houston election is just under 70 years old. It's not the youth activists in the streets. Or we can look at the district attorney, Kim Ogg. When she was first elected, she was viewed as a reformer, and now she's an opponent. She actively opposed pretrial reforms in Harris County, and those were just limited to misdemeanor cases, let alone any larger structural change. That's because, again, she has more to fear from a police union than from activists. In the last Democratic primary, she faced 3 challengers, including a young opponent who was picked by the activists themselves, Audia Jones. Ogg won without a runoff. She won without breaking a sweat. We're talking about grassroots pressure. What grassroots pressure? Apparently the grassroots like the DA. She won. There's this quote that gets stuck in my mind. Apparently Stalin said about the Pope, how many divisions does he control? How many tanks does he have? Well, I want to ask a similar question about activists here. How many campaign donations do they make? How many votes do they cast? How many PACs do they run? How many seats do they hold, or judgeships, or elections do they win? Because in Houston, you see this movement operating without a lot of power. They make noise and they make headlines, but politics at the end of the day is about power.
Wesley, same question. How elected officials respond to grassroots pressure?
Certainly. I mean, I think that, both of my fellow panelists made really important points prior. And to build onto that, I would note that I think that issue becomes even more difficult the higher up the chain you go, where you could have more response to that pressure if applied consistently at a local level versus the national politics still remain several steps, I think, removed from where we see these questions in a lot of local markets. If you look even at the Biden campaign, for example, when they came out with their criminal justice platform in the primary, Joe Biden was still largely talking about quote unquote nonviolent drug offenders. And for folks who are in this space know, we've basically released all the nonviolent drug offenders at this juncture. It's a relative non-issue when we're talking about reforms moving forward, and that also to have an honest grappling with mass incarceration in the states requires understanding that nonviolent drug offenders are such a small portion of the prison population. You could set them all free tomorrow to the extent they're still incarcerated, and it would make absolutely no difference in actually addressing the structural issues in the country, right? And so I think that what we see is that you've got a slate of issues here that are remarkably complex, remarkably difficult, and that many of the solutions, or what appear to be the solutions, look opposite of what several generations of politics around crime have suggested. And in a country that is largely governed by people at their youngest in their 50s, this is going to be a difficult grapple in terms of actually making the shifts and the changes that are needed. As I think Evan noted earlier, there's a remarkable generation gap here. If these questions were up to people 35 and older, our criminal justice system would be upended tomorrow. But unfortunately, that's not what is the case. And so I do think that there is like I said, there's generational factors here. There are the differences between folks who have local and regional constituencies versus folks who are having to have national constituencies. And there's the reality that even as criminal justice becomes a extremely top tier issue in our politics, that doesn't necessarily mean that the folks, no matter their politics, actually have a fluency in the details of the policy and the issues and a full understanding of the depths of the way these problems remain.
As I hear these answers and talking about the grassroots movement, sometimes you've got competing grassroots movements. I know Evan spoke about Kim Ogg. She's being hit by the far right, saying she's becoming way too soft on crime. She's being hit by the far left, saying that she's too strong on crime. And so all of our politicians have to deal with perhaps these competing interests. And maybe the best answer is to get both sides upset, and you've reached a good balance. But we'll move on. What I'd like to do now is discuss the state of the death penalty in the United States, which is obviously the focus of the Texas Defender Service. We've seen a consistent and rapid decline in the use of the death penalty across states in America, including this year. Wesley, do you think this is part of a broader movement to shrink the criminal justice system, or do you think that there's something different happening in the death penalty world?
I don't necessarily believe that the decline in executions being carried out at the state level correlates to a shrinking of the system per se. I think it's linked to the changing of the politics around the death penalty specifically. Sometimes I think about the era that we're in, and as it relates to death penalty eligible crimes, we're in what I would consider kind of an age of innocence, where the average American accepts as a premise that there are in fact innocent people who get convicted. That's very different than just a few decades ago, where the broad assumption was if you were in prison, if you were facing a death penalty, it's because you did it and you deserved it. At this point, the American populace has seen enough movies and read enough books and knows about enough cases where your average American, even the most conservative on crime, accepts as a premise that there are probably some people locked up who didn't do the thing they're accused of, which necessarily shifts public perception of when the state should kill someone. If there's any chance that they didn't do it, then maybe we shouldn't do that. But in terms of actually shrinking the system, I'm not positive that I would go in a national sense. I'm not sure that I would go as far as to say that those two things are necessarily correlated, right? We're still seeing in most cities routine approvals of increasing police and prosecutors' budgets every year, every 2 years. We're seeing, again, even among the Democratic standard bearer, conversations about de-incarceration limited to nonviolent drug offenders, which to me does not signal a significant commitment to shrinking the criminal justice system, because you can't shrink the criminal justice system by handling nonviolent drug offenders. We're not having much conversation about rehabilitation or de-incarceration of so-called violent offenders. We are still, even with steps like the First Step Act, for example, passed under the Trump administration, we are still not talking about letting any significant portion of incarcerated people out. And so I think that while things are trending in a direction like that, I think there are two things that can be true. I think that there can be shift in public opinion that makes people more skeptical of the virtue of the criminal justice system and half a step less punitive that does not in fact result in a significant shrinking of the criminal justice system overall. And I think if I had to assess it today, I think that is probably where we are. I don't think our politics are as punitive as the 80s or the 90s in this moment. I think we're occupying an age of innocence where it's kind of understood some people locked up should not be. And therefore people are less likely to take such drastic and unreversible steps, such as a death penalty. But when we look at the expansion or contraction of the system, we have a system that has contracted in some small spaces, but it's still a behemoth. And so I wouldn't be ready to take the death penalty numbers and extrapolate that represents a significant shift in the size of our criminal justice system.
To move a little further in this regard, many of the demands that we're seeing people are making now have to do with what we might call low-hanging fruit, such as ending cash bail for misdemeanors, ending prosecution for marijuana possession, as Wesley just spoke about. How do you think this affects the continuation of the death penalty?
You know, I don't view these things as the low-hanging fruits. I think of them more like the roots of the tree. 1 in 3 adults has some kind of criminal justice record. 1 in 2 people have a family member who've been incarcerated. That is a lot of people. That is a huge swath of America. And a lot of these cases are low-level crimes. Some of them are violent crimes. But despite that, all these people have families, they have jobs, they have connections to their communities. And when we put them in jail or we put them in prison, at some point they're going to come out. Are they going to come out better or worse? And the questions about cash bail or ending the drug war are about making sure that people end up better. And we're not doing that right now. We're not even thinking about that. We store people in jails that are prone to disease and violence. We assess punishments that are more about inflicting pain than building public safety. We don't even think about the larger goals of the criminal justice system, of protecting and serving, of making everyone better off, of treating everyone with dignity. And if you force the system to start thinking along those lines, to rigorously assess itself, to collect data, to measure outcomes, even at the lowest level, that way of thinking starts to trickle up throughout the system, first at nonviolent crimes, then violent crimes, and then into the death penalty, where we'll start to see that this is not getting the outcomes that we're demanding of the criminal justice system.
Christina, from a slightly different perspective in the legal arena, even as the number of people sentenced to death each year has shrunk dramatically, do you believe race continues to play a role in the imposition of the death penalty? And can you talk about some of the recent cases that have highlighted this issue, including the one you argued?
There has not been a moment in American history when race hasn't played a dominant role in the administration of the death penalty. Black people have always been disproportionately represented among those who have been prosecuted capitally, sentenced to death, and executed. In this country, there's an enormous number of African American men primarily who have been executed for the murder of a white person. There are literally a literal handful of white people who have been executed for the murder of a Black person. The numbers tell the story. And looking specifically at Harris County and Houston itself and Texas itself, the story holds. There has never been a time in Texas history where race hasn't dominated the administration of capital punishment. And that includes going all the way back into the early 1900s. So yes, there's no question about that. And that is the story of the case that I litigated in the United States Supreme Court. And that was the case of Buck versus Davis. That was a Texas case, a Harris County case, where my client, Dwayne Buck, was charged with 2 terrible murders. The question in the case was not going to be one of guilt or innocence. The question in this case was going to be whether or not he was going to be executed or whether he would spend the rest of his life in prison. This was a capital case, so the question to make that sentencing decision was going to revolve around the future dangerousness question. In Texas, the only way a person can be condemned to death is if a jury finds that they are more likely to commit criminal acts of violence in the future. So both the prosecution therefore presents evidence on this point showing, there's some reason to believe that this person is a danger, and presumably the defense presents evidence that the person is not likely to be a danger. In my case, the facts got totally turned on their head. Mr. Buck was represented by appointed counsel who retained an expert to evaluate him and make the determination of whether he was likely to be dangerous in the future. That defense expert concluded that Mr. Buck, one factor that made Mr. Buck more likely to be dangerous in the future was his race. The expert wrote a report, pre-trial, gave it to counsel. That report said, listed a series of factors that he considered in evaluating the future dangerousness question. And one of those factors was literally said race, period. Mr. Buck is more likely to commit criminal acts of violence in the future because he is Black, period. Counsel received that report and read it, and notwithstanding, called that expert to testify at the penalty phase of Mr. Buck's trial. And the prosecutor, capitalized on that evidence once she heard it. Once the expert testified at trial, the prosecutor said, "Can you do that one more time? Am I correct? Are you saying that Mr. Buck is more likely to be dangerous in the future because he's Black?" And the expert said yes. Mr. Buck is condemned to death. When the Texas Defender Service and I, when I was at LDF, got involved in this case, we were horrified, because what we were seeing was a situation where someone was about to be executed literally because of their race. Because in this case, there wasn't evidence, there wasn't other evidence. The Texas Defender Service and the Legal Defense Fund fought Mr. Buck's case for years, through court after court, arguing that no one can be executed based on their race. And I have to tell you that we lost in every court we appeared in before we got to the United States Supreme Court. Only one court in this country actually agreed with us and concluded that a execution like this one, which was going to be, based on a finding of a jury's finding that a person was likely to commit crimes in the future because they were Black, was unconstitutional. So ultimately in 2017, the United States Supreme Court, in a decision authored by Justice John Roberts, struck down Mr. Buck's death sentence and made clear that, in Justice Roberts' words, that we sentence people based on what they do and not who they are. It's not the only big case that has gone to the Supreme Court around issues of race. A couple of years later, we saw the case of Curtis Flowers go to the United States Supreme Court out of Mississippi, Black man convicted of the murder of a white person. And that was a case where the Mississippi prosecutor repeatedly, over multiple trials, I believe there were 5, excluded all African Americans from service on the jury. Time and again, every eligible prospective African American who was called to serve, to be considered for service on that jury, was excluded by the trial prosecutor. Another case, litigated years in multiple courts, and it wasn't until the case went to the United States Supreme Court that justice was served, and the court concluded that the prosecutor's literally unbroken pattern of excluding African Americans from service on this particular capital murder case was unconstitutional. So there have been several cases that show the continuing role of race in the administration of the death penalty. I think right now, though, the question is, how will this court, with its new composition, address these issues? I can tell you we won a 6-2 decision in the Buck case, and I think it's a real question whether we would have a majority with the newest justice being considered on the court. I think it would be a much harder case for us to win. So I think that, how this plays out with a new composition of the Supreme Court and how this court is going to address these really serious issues of race that are going to continue to come up is a $100,000 question.
Well, let's go to a different angle now. So much change happens, for good or bad, based on how media tell stories about criminal justice and those impacted by it. I want to discuss how you all see using media to shape the stories that you feel need to be told. Christina, the Innocence Project has done a good job telling stories about issues with our criminal justice system. Are there ways you see replicating this in the death penalty arena?
Thanks for that great question. The success of the Innocence Project and the story of innocence really is about showing the public how the criminal justice system fails, how the criminal justice system doesn't work in its most fundamental sense. And that has absolutely transformed the way we view the system as a community and as a country, right? The innocence cases have not only shown that the system writ large doesn't work, but it has also undermined really fundamental principles in the system, right? When the innocence cases started to emerge, we were at a time in this country where, I will never forget that face, right? Where eyewitness identification was viewed as absolutely inviolate, right? The best kind of evidence that you could have in a case. And what the innocence cases showed is, in fact, that's completely false, right? A majority of the people who have been wrongly convicted in this country have had eyewitness identification, misidentification evidence presented against them. So the innocence cases have not only shown sort of the criminal justice system makes mistakes, but that really fundamental aspects of evidence that we have relied on are flawed and faulty. It's not just eyewitness identifications, confessions, right? No one in, you know, when this Innocence Movement started, no one could believe that anyone would ever confess to a crime they didn't commit. But what we now have shown, right, what DNA, what science has shown, is that people who are scientifically 100% indisputably proved to be innocent can and do confess to crimes they didn't commit. So absolutely, right, the lesson from the Innocence Movement is, right, these fundamental injustices, when you can highlight sort of fundamental injustice, right, you can transform and shine a light on these really broken aspects of the system. And the same is true of the death penalty, right? The Drain Buck case is a great example of how, you know, you focus on a really glaring and fundamental injustice, and you use it as a powerful way of showing how a particular aspect of the criminal legal system doesn't work. In this case, right, this assessment of future dangerousness, which frankly is an absurd question that really can't be, which really can't be gauged, and really does invite, right, the kinds of false assumptions linked to race that you saw in the Dwayne Buck case.
Leslie, you've obviously made your career talking about movements committed to racial justice and equality. Do you see the media finding the right stories on their own, or do you see a need to push the agenda?
I think there's always a need for folks who are the closest to work and closest to systems to be helping provide tips and framework and information. That the reality is your average member of the media is not a subject matter expert in criminal justice, is not seeing how the system works. And in fact, as the media contracts, you have fewer reporters in courtrooms, fewer reporters covering prosecutors, fewer reporters even in the cop shops, right? And so you're having more journalism being produced by people with less direct interaction with these systems, which makes it less likely they're going to see the ways that these systems work or more explicitly do not work. And so I think it's extremely important for those conversations to be happening and for things to be surfacing. I would remind people who are practitioners that they do, you know, they are the key sources. They know what cases they're dealing with. They know what's coming up on the docket. They know what questions are being asked, while most people who are producing the media that the public is seeing on these questions don't have access to all of that information. And so I think that's really important. I mean, in my career, it's been really important for me, the interactions I've had with everyone from defense attorneys to prosecutors to civil rights groups to folks who have eyes into the system and can help me understand, is a given case an outlier, or is this actually something that is part of a bigger structural problem? Can help me contextualize things properly. And so I do think it's really important to have that type of participation with the media.
The news media plays a major role, as we've just discussed, in how people understand the criminal justice system. Specifically, though, how do you see dealing with either the criminals gone wild type of story or the actual bad facts of a particularly heinous crime?
And this is something that I actually asked of Arnold Ventures when I first started working there, talking to all of the policy experts and people with decades of experience within the criminal justice system as they were trying to implement reforms to shrink the footprint, to make sure that more people could live free lives. I put to them, how do you prevent the next Willie Horton? How do you stop people from freaking out over an individual crime that really sets back the movement? And someone said to me, like, well, you don't. Crimes happen. It happens under the status quo. It'll happen under reforms. And it's easy to tell these bad stories. Just watch your local news or read the New York Post and you'll see people freaking out about crimes, whether rates are going up or whether rates are going down. One of the funny things that happened in the New York Post specifically was that after New York passed its own pretrial reform, every day was another horror story on the front page. And every day people were saying, see, we can't do these reforms because crime goes out of control. Well, a few weeks later, the New York Post ran its own report showing that NYPD's data indicated that these reforms were not causing the increase in violent crime that people were worried about. It was a fascinating divergence between the picture on the front page and the actual text that reporters were writing. And another angle to it is that it's really easy to tell these stories because when someone gets shot or murdered or something terrible happens, it gets reported as part of the criminal justice system. We don't report when people are helped. We don't report when, due to reforms, a dad who had to stay in jail instead could stay at home, or a son got to go to work, or a family stayed together, or a person who would have died in jail didn't. You know, how do you tell the story of Sandra Bland, a young woman driving down the street who didn't get pulled over by the cops and didn't die in jail? That doesn't make for a news story. And even when you can talk about how people directly benefit from policy changes, folks don't like to talk about their involvement with the criminal justice system. That is more often than not the worst day of their lives. They are embarrassed, they are ashamed, they don't want the world seeing it. I did see one powerful report put out by the ACLU after New Jersey implemented its own pretrial reforms. It was about a young kid about to start vocational school. And the day before, he got in a fight with his stepdad. Now, under the previous system, he would have stayed in jail for a day, maybe longer, depending on whether or not he could afford cash bail. He would have missed his first day of class, probably second day, maybe even more, probably not graduated. But he didn't go to jail. He got out, he went to class, he got his degree, and he got a job, and he even patched stuff up with his stepdad. Jail would have made everything worse. And I think that's the story that we need to put on the media more, that people involved with the criminal justice system are deserving of dignity, they belong in society, and we need to craft a system that makes them better off. But it's not just the news side. There's also fiction. Watching any TV show on network TV about cops and robbers or crime will make you think that murder is happening all the time, everywhere, and that just behind every corner is another dead body waiting for you. At least that's what I learned from watching Law and Order. The fact of the matter is that we live in a relatively safe society. It's not safe for everyone. It's not safe everywhere. But if you look at a breakdown, for example, of calls to 911, only 20% are about crime at all. The rest are about welfare checks on people or traffic concerns or quality of life issues. Only 1% of those calls are about violent crime. It falls on reporters not just to tell the accurate story, but the true story, and one that reflects on the reality and puts it all in its proper context. And that's hard. It's hard to tell that story because fundamentally, narrative requires tension. And if there's no tension and no conflict and everyone's happy, that's boring.
Let me say that, as I expected, this has been a remarkable discussion. The three of you are the ones that can tell the story, make the changes, and make us all, most importantly, think about what we can do. On behalf of the Texas Defender Service, the audience, myself, I want to thank each of you for this remarkable discussion. Thank you. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a number of questions to go to the panel. Let me start with the first one. I would postulate that most people in the United States, if asked, would agree there needs to be some type of criminal justice reform. But I'd like to move specifically to the death penalty. Do you think that the majority of Americans are still in favor of the death penalty, against it? How do you see the direction, and what do you see happening in the next 10 or 15 years in that regard? Let me start with you, Christina.
Hey, thank you. That's a great question. At this moment, the public support for the death penalty is pretty low relative to recent history. I think it's just north of 50%. Perhaps the more significant number, though, is the percentage of people who would prefer a life without parole sentence when given the option, right? The polling shows that if asked, would you prefer a life without parole sentence or a death sentence, there's a significant number of people who actually prefer a life without parole sentence to a death sentence. And that is absolutely a function of the work that has been done in the capital defense community and elsewhere, showing just how problematic the death penalty process is. You know, how that people do not have quality counsel, how race continues to play a role in the administration of the death penalty, how prosecutors, you know, seek death inappropriately. Sort of all of the right, how executions are actually ultimately torture, right? Lethal injection. So I think that the work that has been done, and I should add, how could I forget, most notably, right, concerns about innocence and executing someone who is innocent. So I think that those concerns, the work that has been done to raise these concerns around the implementation of the death penalty, you know, persist because the problems persist. And I think that going forward, that, you know, that there will remain, I believe, right, the support for the death penalty will remain low.
Thanks. Evan, any perspective?
Well, I usually like to look to data, and I don't have any surveys in front of me about declining support for the death penalty. But one data point really stands out, especially right now. It's that Joe Biden's platform for the presidency says that he wants to eliminate the death penalty. And he's never had that position before. Democrats have never had that position before. We're seeing things change. But even after we talk about the death penalty, I think we have to talk about this larger issue of people having life sentences in jail or in prison, having overly long sentences in prison. The United States stands out in a bad way among developed Western nations in how long we put people behind bars. No other nation of our stature has people behind bars for longer than 20 years. And people are dying there. Our prisons are turning into retirement homes. None of these people pose threats to anyone, and yet we keep them there. Something has to change in the way we think about the criminal justice system and focus on an overarching sense of what public safety really means.
Leslie?
Sure. I mean, Christina summarized the latest Gallup polling correctly. I think it's 56% of Americans support the death penalty, 42% oppose. A few things are true. That's a low point, certainly in recent history, although is not a particularly low amount of support historically. That typically about 60% of Americans support the death penalty. Those numbers spiked in the 80s and 90s amid the crime wave. Although we're once as low as, I want to say 47 or 45% in the late 60s, right? So this is not even the lowest support has ever been for the death penalty. It is really interesting, you know, a vast majority of Americans do, as Christina noted, do in this polling support life sentences when they're given the option over the death penalty. But what I would note is that when we center, this builds on what Christina and Evan said, right? We are, in some ways, conversations about the death penalty show how narrow our space of justice and reform is in the first place. We're taking the single rarest event in the criminal justice system, and a majority of Americans still support it happening. We're not, that locking people up for the rest of their lives is the reform solution, right? That is not a particularly progressive step. That's not to in any way take away from the important work of Innocence Projects as they've worked around death issues. That's not to suggest that hasn't helped shift and shape. But again, we're talking about the most extreme thing the government does punitively, and currently a larger percentage of Americans support it than the late 60s. And the alternative is locking people up the rest of their lives. That is still a remarkably punitive system that is not that far away from where it has been previously.
Now that we have the three of you, the experts here, I want to ask a question that doesn't deal with facts, doesn't deal with surveys. I just want a quick, your gut reaction. 15 years from now, I believe we will still have the death penalty in the United States. Wesley?
I don't know. I think one of the things that's difficult is that it can be hard to measure the exponential potential for change. And so we don't know what we don't know about the future. I think that, 15 years ago was 2005, which feels like a lifetime ago, and the reality wasn't that long ago as it relates to some of the changes that have happened across our criminal justice system. What's also true is the complexity, kind of state by state. I'd like to say that yes, we would not have it, but I also know, especially around these issues and the politics of them, how remarkably sensitive things can be. Next year could be the year we enter a 20-year crime wave. And I have no idea what politics that would usher in. I have an idea, but the extent to them, or what that might look like, right? We're at the end of what's been a historic downtick, or we're in the midst of what's been a historic downtick in crime and rise in safety across the states. There's a world where, look, if there's recession, if there's war, if there's who knows what happens, the fundamentals could change. And so I try to stay out of the prediction game to the extent possible.
Evan, your gut reaction.
Well, to go from my gut, I'm going to say that no, I don't think we're going to have the death penalty anymore in 15 years. But I don't think that's necessarily a positive thing. I think that you're going to see politicians try to latch onto it as a singular policy issue rather than looking at larger structural reforms, that it's going to divide people in ways that make for good media and make for good political campaigns, and is going to suck up a lot of energy. I think that people don't always know the right way to talk about the changes that they want to see happen in the criminal justice system and throughout society. They don't have the right language or terminology or really in-depth understanding of how structures work, but they want to see something happen. And this would be a big thing that would make headlines. It would also make a lot of antagonists angry, which I think is a critical part of political narrative too, that you need to piss off the people you don't like. And to see a lot of divided lines over whether or not we keep the death penalty just seems to have the real makings for a political campaign that eventually, because of changing demographics and because it would not have any massive other structural changes, you could win it.
Christina, your chance now. Gut reaction.
So we now have a 6-3 conservative majority on the United States Supreme Court. So if the question is, will the death penalty be declared unconstitutional in the next 15 years? The answer is probably not. However, building, I think, on Evan's point, and the reality is, right, that the death penalty is administered locally, right? I think there's an enormous amount of political sort of energy and will around criminal justice reform that will put pressure on the system locally, right, to discourage continued use of the death penalty, imposition of death sentences. So I can see a circumstance, and I would envision a circumstance where functionally, right, we don't have a meaningfully functioning death penalty, but I think it will still be on the books.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we've got a number of great questions, but we're running out of time. And so since we have the three of you experts in this area, I think the best question I've seen is I'd like to turn to each of you. And as a presidential moderator, I will say limit it to 1 minute uninterrupted for you to give us one point that you would like to communicate to the public or that you think is important for us to be thinking about when it comes to criminal justice reform. Wesley, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, to echo a point I was making recently, I think that we have to be more expansive in our thinking about these questions. I was, like Evan, I was encouraged by seeing statements like presidential candidate Biden supporting an end to the death penalty, and also much of his criminal justice policy talks about nonviolent drug offenders, a group of people who've basically all already been freed, and if we freed any remaining ones tomorrow, would do nothing to stem mass incarceration in the United States of America. That our conversations have to become more complicated. We spend a lot of time talking about actual innocence, death penalty cases, and nonviolent offenders. Those conversations, while important, often mask the realities of our criminal justice system, that we have to do something with violent offenders, that drug addiction often leads to violent crime, that many people who are in prison for drugs are not there because they were caught with drugs, but rather because they mugged an old lady on the street to get money for drugs, or they broke into a drugstore, right? And beyond that, and so I just think that we have to be willing to have more complicated conversations, certainly in the family spaces. You know, you understand why some of the political decisions are made the way they're made, but if the hope is to actually in any way significantly change the system, which is the stated hope of a lot of people in this space, we've got to really wrestle with the nuances and complexities of these systems and come up with solutions that address the root problems, and get to places where we're talking about real rehabilitation, where we're structuring a system that's less punitive from the beginning, even for people who are guilty and have done the bad thing. And so that we can incentivize building a system that actually gets people out and able to return to society.
Thanks. Christina, 1 minute, your 1 point to get across.
Listen, the power of, and I agree with everything Wesley said 100%. I would just say that the power, of course, of the Innocence Movement and the stories of innocent people being wrongly convicted of capital murder, wrongly sentenced to death, is ultimately it shines a light on the ways in which the system is broken for everyone. And it does that for the death penalty as much as it does it for showing how eyewitness identification procedures are flawed. The Innocence Movement shows the flaws in the death penalty as much as it shows, you know, that police procedures like, you know, lineups, like police using deception and interrogation, right? It shows how those procedures are, you know, putting people in prison and jail wrongly. So in the same way that the Innocence Movement has done that, it has also shined a light on the problems with the death penalty, because the people who have been wrongly convicted and sentenced to death, you know, have been subject to the same experiences that so many people that are still on death row are subject to. They experienced wholly inadequate counsel at trial. They experienced prosecutors who, you know, use these cases for political gain, rushes to judgment, withholding of exculpatory evidence. The things that happen to the innocent people have happened time and again to the rest of the folks on death row. And so for all of those reasons, right, we need to be concerned about, and we need to actually not be concerned about, we need to understand that the death penalty system is broken as much for the innocent as it is for everyone else that goes through the process.
Thanks, Christina. And now to finish the questioning, Evan, your 1 minute, 1 point you want to get across.
Well, I really feel like that we're all talking along this similar thread that we need to expand the way that we think about the criminal justice system. And I just want to keep going with that we need to have a broader, more holistic sense of what we mean when we talk about public safety. That when we arrest someone for a crime, the point of that is to make everybody safer, but it doesn't necessarily make that person safer to put them in a dangerous jail. It doesn't necessarily make their family safer if that person was a breadwinner, if that person was a father or a brother. It hurts their families. It doesn't necessarily make a community safer to pluck young men out at a young age and then release them back without any preparation for job training, for socialization, for the normal skills that people are supposed to have. That our entire criminal justice system inflicts a different kind of harm that we don't measure, that doesn't appear in FBI stats. And we need to find ways to make society safer using tools and policies that don't inherently rely on pulling a gun or arresting someone or putting somebody in a cage. And sometimes this can feel a little touchy-feely. It can feel a little bleeding heart, but that's not it. It is about aiming science and data collection at policies to ensure that they work, that people are actually better off. And it will take a lot of hard research. It will take a lot of hard advocacy. And it means tearing down the barriers in our mind when we think about what we say when we say public safety.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Christina, Evan, Wesley. Thank you for giving us the benefit of your thoughts. But more importantly, thank you for your actions on behalf of criminal justice reform. This has been an honor for me to chair this event and to meet each of you. And I think you've given us all something more to think about. So thank you all again very, very much.